The drive alone was its own kind of meditation. Miles of winding country lanes, hedgerows blurring into a continuous green wall, the hum of the engine a steady, predictable rhythm. I liked predictable. My life, my work, it was all about the meticulous, the painstaking, the slow, deliberate unveiling of what once was. Restoring a chipped porcelain figurine to its original delicate grace, coaxing the vibrant hues back into a faded tapestry, or reassembling the intricate gears of a broken antique clock until its steady tick-tock filled the silence once more. That was my world. A world of precise measurements, specialized solvents, and infinite patience. It was a solitary existence, but one I'd chosen, and one that suited me just fine. But this inheritance. This was a different kind of project entirely. The solicitor's letter, crisp and formal, had spoken of a substantial rural property and a distant, heretofore unknown relative. My initial reaction had been a shrug, a mild curiosity. Now, as the GPS finally announced, with a flat, electronic tone, "You have arrived at your destination," I looked out at what lay before me and felt a distinct chill that had nothing to do with the late autumn air. The manor wasn't just old, it was ancient, a hulking silhouette against the bruised gray sky. Its stone facade was a patchwork of crumbling masonry, some sections choked by ivy thick as a man's arm, others scarred by what looked like ancient repairs. Windows, dozens of them, were either boarded up or shattered, gaping black eyes that seemed to stare without seeing. The entire structure sagged, its roofline uneven, its chimneys leaning precariously like drunken sentinels. The air here was heavy, laden with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else. Something metallic and musty, like old blood and forgotten dust. I cut the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant, mournful cry of an unseen bird. I sat there for a long moment, my hand still gripping the steering wheel, a knot forming in my stomach. This wasn't just neglect, this felt like an active surrender to decay, a deliberate letting go. It felt less like a building and more like a sleeping beast, its breath the damp, cold air, its eyes the broken windows. The front door groaned as I pushed it open further. A wave of stagnant, cold air washed over me, carrying with it that peculiar, metallic musty odor. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a vast, echoing entrance hall. Cobwebs, thick and gray, draped from the ceiling like grotesque tapestries. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of weak sunlight piercing a high, stained glass window. The grand staircase, once magnificent, now sagged, its banister splintered, its steps creaking ominously under my weight as I tested the first one. I moved through the ground floor, each room a testament to forgotten lives and a slow, agonizing demise. Furniture, shrouded in white sheets, loomed like ghosts. Walls were peeling, revealing layers of floral wallpaper from different eras. In the dining room, a massive table was still set, though the cutlery was tarnished black and the plates were caked with years of grime. It was less a house and more a mausoleum of memories. My intention was to conduct a thorough, room-by-room assessment, to understand the scope of the restoration needed. I had my tools, my notes, my determined resolve. I ascended the main staircase, the wood groaning beneath my weight like an old man sighing. I pushed open a particularly heavy, unmarked door at the very end of a long, narrow passage. My flashlight beam cut through the absolute blackness within, and then stopped, frozen. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. This wasn't another bedroom, or a study, or even a utility space. This was something else entirely. Heavy iron doors, each with a small, grimy viewport, lined one side, evenly spaced, leading off into individual cells. My light revealed faint, faded numbers painted above each door, and a narrow, barred window at the far end, too high to offer any view beyond a sliver of gray sky. And then I saw the faded, hand-painted sign, barely legible on the wall directly opposite me, its letters chipped and almost entirely obscured by grime and time. What was this? A macabre joke? A forgotten, unspeakable past? The phrase hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. This wasn't just an old house, this was a place that had swallowed something terrible, and now, it seemed, I was here to dig it up. A place. The thought trailed off, leaving a bitter taste on my tongue. The dust motes, dancing in the lone shaft of sunlight filtering through a grimy window, seemed to shimmer with an unseen energy. I stood in the grand hall, the silence pressing in, heavy and ancient. My initial elation at inheriting such a magnificent, if derelict, project had curdled into a wary unease. The cryptic inscription, the chilling implication of a forgotten past, it had unsettled me more profoundly than I cared to admit. I took a deep breath, pushing down the prickle of apprehension. My hands, usually steady and precise, trembled slightly. This was ridiculous. I was a restorer, a craftsman. My job was to peel back layers of time, not invent ghostly narratives. The house was old, yes. It had secrets, naturally. Every building this age did. My professional curiosity, a far more reliable compass than this sudden, irrational fear, demanded I proceed. I decided to start small, to impose order on at least one corner of the chaos. The old study, located just off the main hall, seemed a reasonable choice. Its heavy oak door, surprisingly intact, suggested a room that had been less exposed to the elements than some of the others. I retrieved my toolbox from the van, the metallic clank echoing loudly in the stillness, and gathered my initial supplies, drop cloths, various sized brushes, gentle solvents, and a selection of delicate scrapers. Inside the study, the air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and dry rot, a familiar perfume in my line of work. I spread a drop cloth over the worn Persian rug, its colors muted by decades of dust. My first task was to assess a small writing desk, its surface scarred by rings and scratches. I carefully laid out my tools on a clean section of the cloth, a badger hairbrush, a microspatula, a small bottle of mild wood cleaner. I picked up the badger brush, gave the desk a tentative sweep, then set the brush back down, turning to retrieve a magnifying loupe from my kit. When I turned back, the badger brush wasn't there. I blinked. Had I placed it somewhere else? I was meticulous, almost pathologically so, about my tools. Each had its designated spot. I scanned the cloth, then the surrounding floor. Nothing. A faint prickle traced my spine. I shook my head. Absent-mindedness. It had to be. I rummaged through my kit for another brush, a coarser one, deciding to give the desk a more thorough initial cleaning. An hour later, as I was carefully applying a restorative oil to a particularly dry section of the desk, I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across rough plaster, from somewhere above me. I froze, my hand hovering. The house was enormous, full of settling timbers and wind-blown debris. It was probably just the wind. Just the slow, rhythmic drip of a leaky gutter outside. I dismissed it, resuming my work. Then, a fleeting movement in my peripheral vision. I whipped my head around. Of course, nothing. My imagination, running wild after the earlier discovery. I focused on the desk, trying to lose myself in the familiar rhythm of restoration. But the feeling persisted, a distinct impression of being observed, a prickle on the back of my neck that made me constantly want to glance over my shoulder. The badger brush, the one I thought I'd misplaced, was now sitting on the very edge of the desk, directly in my line of sight. Not where I would have put it, not where I had thought I had put it, but in an impossible spot, almost as if it had been placed there for me to find. This wasn't absent-mindedness. Determined to shake off the growing unease, I decided to tackle the bookcase. It was a magnificent piece, overflowing with brittle, leather-bound tomes. Many of the lower shelves were empty, their contents perhaps long plundered or simply rotted away. As I began to gently dust the exposed wood, my fingers brushed against a section of the paneling near the floor, behind where a particularly large, empty space yawned. It felt slightly loose, yielding under pressure. My breath hitched. Curiosity, a more powerful force than fear in that moment, propelled me forward. I pressed harder, feeling a faint click. Every instinct screamed at me to close the panel, to ignore it, to leave this house. But the meticulous part of me, the part that always needed to uncover every layer, every hidden detail, wouldn't allow it. The walls were rough-hewn stone, dripping with condensation. The passage sloped downwards, the ceiling becoming lower, forcing me to crouch. My boots crunched on loose gravel and what felt like larger, sharper shards. Finally, the tunnel opened into a much larger space. The very atmosphere here felt different, heavier, laden with an unspoken weight. This was no ordinary forgotten passage. My gaze landed on a corroded plaque, half obscured by grime, affixed to the wall near the first door. I squinted, reading the faint, raised letters. The words seemed to jump out at me, each one a hammer blow to my composure, making the blood drain from my face. It read, "Old Death Row Corridor marked for closure." The world tilted. And I had just opened its door. My initial elation at inheriting such a grand, if crumbling, estate was beginning to curdle into something far more complex, a stew of fascination and a creeping, indefinable dread. I was Reed, a restorer of the forgotten, and this house, in its magnificent decay, was both my greatest challenge and, I was slowly realizing, perhaps my undoing. I moved through the grand hall, my boots echoing on the stripped floorboards. The dust motes still danced in the lone shaft of sunlight, but now they seemed to swirl with a purpose, almost beckoning. My meticulous nature, the very core of my craft, demanded order from chaos. I couldn't simply stand there, lost in atmosphere. I had work to do. My tools lay scattered on a canvas dropcloth, chisels, mallets, brushes, a small, powerful LED torch. I dismissed it, attributing it to the house's age and years of neglect. My fingers traced the intricate carvings on a particularly imposing section of paneling near the fireplace. It was unusually thick, a slight variation in the grain, almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it. I tapped it lightly with the butt of a screwdriver. Thunk. Solid. I moved a few inches to the left. Then, an inch further. Thwack. This was it. The thrill of discovery, a familiar surge in my chest, pushed aside the lingering unease. I set to work with renewed vigor, carefully prying at the seams, looking for any hidden latch or mechanism. Hours blurred. My muscles ached. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the grimy windows in shades of bruised purple and orange before surrendering to the encroaching twilight. I flipped on my headlamp, its beam cutting a sharp path through the gloom. Finally, after much patient probing, I found it, a tiny, almost invisible button disguised as part of the decorative carving. I pressed it. The walls were rough-hewn, unlike the finished elegance of the study. This was not part of the original design, but an afterthought, sealed away. I hesitated, a prickle of caution running down my spine. The house had been silent for so long, and now this hidden space seemed to hum with a low, almost inaudible vibration. But my determination, the restorer's impulse to uncover and understand, was stronger than my apprehension. I stepped into the passage, my torch beam dancing ahead. The steps led into a cramped, low-ceilinged chamber. The air was heavy, as if it had been holding its breath for centuries. My light swept across the rough stone walls, revealing a single, heavily reinforced iron door at the far end. And on the wall beside it, etched crudely into the stone, were a series of tally marks, hundreds of them, and beneath them, a single, faded inscription, "The condemned await." My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The phrase, taken from an obscure historical footnote in the Manor's deeds, had always puzzled me, referring to a part of the local institution that was supposed to have been torn down decades ago. But here it was, hidden beneath the manor, extending into the very bedrock. The corridors stretched into the blackness, lined with identical iron doors, each one rusted shut. My torch beam caught on something in the small chamber I'd entered first, tucked into a niche in the wall, almost invisible in the gloom. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover flaking, held shut with a tarnished brass clasp. I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly. The leather felt dry and brittle under my touch. Opening it, I was met with brittle, yellowed pages filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. The ink was faded, but legible. The entries were dated, spanning a period in the late 1800s. They hunger not for flesh, but for what makes us us. The erosion is slow, insidious. First the names, then the faces, then the very memories of joy. The wardens, they tried to seal it, but it finds the cracks. No names, no specific events, just the terrifying implication of something that consumed identity. My head began to throb. The air in the chamber felt thin, as if something was drawing the oxygen out of it. I closed the journal, the brass clasp clicking shut with a sharp finality. My mind reeled. This wasn't mere local history, this was a confession, a warning. I tried to recall the specific details of the manor's history I'd read, the dates, the former occupants. But the names, the faces. They felt fuzzy around the edges. A specific architect I'd been researching, a key figure in the manor's original construction, his name eluded me. I knew it. It was on the tip of my tongue, a familiar echo, yet utterly out of reach. I frowned, running a hand through my hair. Stress, I told myself. Isolation. It was bound to mess with my head. I needed to get out of this hidden passage, back into the familiar, if unsettling, study. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, I couldn't quite remember why I was here, in this crumbling manor, or even who Reed was. Of course, I was Reed. I closed the journal, the rough leather cool against my fingertips, but the chill that ran through me had nothing to do with temperature. My head was a drum, each beat a dull throb behind my eyes, and the air truly did feel thin, as if a silent vacuum was slowly drawing the breath from the room. I stumbled back from the alcove, the single lamp casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch and twist, mocking my vision. The cryptic entries, the terrifying implication of something that consumed identity, it was too much to simply dismiss as the ravings of a forgotten occupant. The manor was a labyrinth of secrets, and I felt I'd just tugged on a thread that threatened to unravel everything. The next morning, the headache was a dull echo, but the unease had settled deep into my bones. I packed a small bag, the thought of returning to the dusty archive a strange comfort. The drive to the nearest town felt longer than usual, the familiar landscape somehow altered, subtly off-kilter. The town's historical society was housed in a squat brick building, smelling of old paper and dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight. The curator, a woman with spectacles perched on her nose and a kind, weary smile, directed me to the local records. "Looking into the old Blackwood estate, are we?" she'd asked, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Not many do these days." I spent hours poring over brittle microfiche and yellowed newspaper clippings. The manor, I learned, had a long and troubled history. There were no grand scandals, no dramatic murders that made headlines. Instead, it was a slow, insidious pattern. I found mentions of a former landowner, a prominent figure, who had simply vanished in the late 1800s, leaving no trace. The reports were strangely muted, almost apologetic, as if the local constabulary hadn't quite known how to classify the absence. Then there were the accounts of subsequent residents. A wealthy merchant who, after purchasing the estate, began to exhibit peculiar forgetfulness, often not recognizing his own staff or even his family. His journal, briefly quoted in a local history book, spoke of losing the thread, of slipping through the gaps in my own mind. He eventually died in the manor, described only as being lost to himself. Another family, relocating from the city, lasted barely 2 years before they abruptly sold the property at a significant loss, citing unbearable pressures and a pervasive sense of disorientation. The wording was always vague, hinting at madness without ever explicitly stating it. No one ever claimed to have seen anything specific, just experienced a slow erosion of their own sense of self. My own memories felt fragile. Back at the manor, the twilight deepened with a speed that felt unnatural. I made myself a simple meal, but the food tasted like ash. That night, the nightmares began in earnest. Faces flickered past, familiar yet unidentifiable. The worst part wasn't the fear, but the profound sense of loss. I couldn't remember what I'd dreamed, only the terrifying feeling of something vital being stripped away. The next few days were a blur. I'd walk into a room, intent on a task, only to stand there, utterly blank, unable to recall why I'd entered. Tools would appear in my workspace that I didn't remember taking out. Sometimes, I'd find myself humming a tune I couldn't place, a melody that felt both intimately familiar and utterly alien. The passage opened into a wider, low-ceilinged area, unlit and utterly silent. Each door was thick, studded with rivets, and bore a small, grimy peephole. As I walked further, my boots scuffing on the uneven flagstones, I saw it. Death row? Here? In a manor house? The word seemed to mock me, a grim, impossible joke. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile this brutal, institutional label with the decaying elegance of the house. Was this a sick joke by a previous owner? A sudden, sharp crack echoed from behind one of the iron doors. I froze, every muscle tensed. It sounded like a bone snapping, or a heavy chain being dragged across stone. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I wanted to run, to flee this horrifying place, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. I stood there, paralyzed, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand, illuminating the stark, terrifying reality of the corridor. My own name suddenly felt foreign on my tongue. I couldn't remember what I was looking for, or even why I was in the manor at all. The microfiche machine hummed, a lonely, mechanical sigh in the dusty silence of the manor's makeshift study. My eyes, gritty and strained, scanned another faded article. The pattern, once a subtle whisper, was now a growing shout. Not grand, bloody tragedies, no. Instead, the local papers documented a strange, recurring malady among the manor's past occupants. A slow, insidious mental decline. The articles spoke of him wandering the grounds, muttering to himself, his once sharp mind dissolving into a fog. He died in the manor, alone, his passing noted with a brief, almost dismissive paragraph. It wasn't just Finch. Other, less prominent figures connected to the property, a caretaker from the 1880s, a distant relative who'd briefly taken residence in the 1920s, all met similar ends. It craved essence. It consumed the very fabric of who people were. And I, in my meticulous restoration, was exposing it, waking it, and offering myself up as the next meal. My gaze drifted from the screen to the old, hand-drawn blueprint I'd unearthed from a forgotten desk drawer yesterday. A sealed-off wing, deep in the foundations, below the main living quarters. The blueprint simply labeled it, storage. But a faint, almost erased pencil notation beside the X read, corridor. Storage? I knew this place like the back of my hand now, or so I thought. This section didn't align with any of the visible basements or cellars. It was deeper, more hidden. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I grabbed my heavy-duty lantern and a crowbar, the weight of the metal a small comfort against the growing unease. No door, no archway, just a solid, imposing barrier. This was it. The X on the blueprint. With a grunt, I wedged the crowbar into a hairline crack between the stones and pried. The stone shifted, then another. It took an hour of back-breaking work, but eventually, I created an opening large enough to squeeze through. My lantern beam pierced the absolute blackness beyond. Who or what had been confined here, and why? I stepped inside, my boots crunching on something fine and gritty, not dust, but what felt like pulverized stone and ancient rust. The iron doors, set deep into the stone, were all identical, each with a small, barred slit at eye level. They looked like cages, not rooms. A low, almost imperceptible hum started, originating from no single point, but seeming to vibrate from the very stone itself. It was a sound that resonated not in my ears, but in my teeth, in the marrow of my bones. Not actual words, not at first. The sound of my own voice seemed alien, thin, and reedy. The hum intensified, vibrating through my chest. But they weren't speaking to me, they were speaking through me. Memories, sudden and vivid, flashed before my eyes, not my own memories, but disjointed snippets of other lives. A child's cry, a woman's sob, a man's desperate plea. Raid. My hands started to tremble, the lantern beam shaking wildly. This was not real. This was the manor, the entity, playing its tricks. Suddenly, the corridor seemed to stretch infinitely, the end receding into an impossible distance. The iron doors melted into each other, then reformed, each one now bearing a faint, swirling impression of a face, gaunt, terrified, their eyes wide and pleading. They weren't just faces on the doors, they were in the doors, pressed against the metal, screaming silently. Panic began to claw at my throat. Reed. My name is Reed. I restore antiques. They were the voices of those who had been here before, those whose memories had been stripped away, whose identities had been devoured. And now they were trying to take mine. For a terrifying moment, I forgot my purpose, forgot the manor, forgot even the concept of myself. I stood there, lantern clutched in a white-knuckled grip, a puppet with no strings, no puppeteer, just an empty shell. The world around me dissolved into a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and shapes, the corridor warping and twisting like a funhouse mirror. Then, a flicker. A memory of my workbench, the scent of linseed oil, the smooth curve of a mahogany armrest. My craft. My identity. I clung to it, a desperate anchor in a sea of madness. No. This is me. I am Reed. This is not real. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my forehead against the cold stone, trying to physically push back against the onslaught. The attack was relentless, a psychological maelstrom. It tried to pry open every crack in my being, to sever the ties that bound me to myself. It wasn't just trying to make me forget, it was trying to become me, or erase me entirely. I stumbled backward, away from the farthest end of the corridor, my mind screaming in silent protest. Each swirling face seemed to twist into a grotesque smile, their eyes fixed on me, knowing. I crawled, scrambled, anything to get out, to escape the crushing weight of those stolen identities. My lungs burned, my head throbbed. Finally, I burst through the opening, gasping for air, collapsing onto the dusty sub-basement floor. My body ached, but it was my mind that felt truly ravaged. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart hammering against my ribs, struggling to piece together the fragments of what I just experienced. Was that real? Or had the isolation finally broken me? No. It wasn't a hallucination. It was an invasion. A direct, terrifying assault on the very core of who I was. The entity wasn't just in the manor, it was in my head, picking at the seams of myself, trying to unravel me thread by thread. The cold seeped through my work gloves, a sharp, grounding sensation. This is not real. I chanted it in my head, a frantic mantra against the rising tide of panic. This is the manor, the entity, playing its tricks. My breath hitched, a ragged gasp in the suffocating silence. When I dared to open my eyes again, the corridor had settled. This wasn't just old dust and unsettling architecture anymore. This was a presence, malevolent and deliberate, twisting my perception. The restoration could wait. My sanity, my very self, was unraveling. Now. I turned on my heel, resolve hardening my spine, and headed in what I hoped was the direction of the main hall. The journey felt longer than it should have, the turns more numerous. Had I taken this route before? Finally, I reached what should have been the grand entrance hall. It was certainly grand, with its sweeping staircase and high, vaulted ceiling, but the colossal oak doors that should have led to the outside were gone. No hinges, no handle, no trace of a doorway. just seamless, impenetrable stone. I ran a trembling hand over the surface, my fingers scraping against the uneven texture. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the hall, frantic. This isn't right. I spun around, searching for another way. The side door, the one that led to the kitchen and then a small, seldom-used back exit, was my next hope. The kitchen was a mess of forgotten implements and cobwebs, just as I'd left it. But the door leading to the service stairwell, which in turn led to the back exit, was now a window. A tall, narrow window, its panes thick with grime, looking out onto a brick wall just inches away. Not an outside wall, but another interior wall, blocking any light or view. It was as if the manor had swallowed itself, folding in on its own dimensions. Panic began to claw its way up my throat. I tried the windows in the drawing room, the library, even the small, disused pantry. The outside world had simply ceased to exist. My thoughts raced. If I couldn't get out, I had to call for help. My phone. Where was my phone? Had I left it charging somewhere? I dimly recalled setting it down in the study, hours ago, or was it days? Time was becoming a fluid, meaningless concept in this house. I stumbled back towards the study, my heart thudding against my ribs. The room was just as I'd left it, a chaos of blueprints, antique tools, and half-eaten sandwiches. My phone, a mundane slab of black plastic and glass, lay on the desk beside my laptop. A wave of relief, so potent it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. I snatched it up, my fingers fumbling with the unlock button. No signal. The little bars were empty, replaced by a red X. I tried again, walking to the window, then to the center of the room, then back to the door. Nothing. Not a flicker. The landline, a dusty, old-fashioned rotary phone in the hall, was equally dead. My laptop, when I finally managed to boot it up, couldn't find a Wi-Fi network. The internet, the lifeline to the world, was severed. It was then, in my frantic search for a signal, that I pushed open a door I swore I'd never seen before. It was tucked away, almost imperceptible, behind a tapestry in a lesser-used antechamber. Beyond it lay a narrow, claustrophobic passage, distinct from any other part of the manor. The walls were unadorned stone, scarred with deep, crude etchings that looked like tally marks. The ceiling pressed down, making me feel like I needed to hunch to pass through. Death row? In my manor? Closure. A finality. Not just for the corridor, but for whatever poor souls had been confined within. And now, for me. This wasn't just a house. It was a prison. Meticulously crafted, designed to trap. And I was the latest inmate. Had I walked past this corridor 100 times and simply not seen it? Or had it manifested, like the solid wall in the main hall, purely for me? I clutched my phone, still displaying its cruel no-service message, a useless brick in my trembling hand. The manor wasn't just old. It was alive, and it was deliberately cutting me off, severing every last thread to the world I knew. I was alone, truly alone, trapped within its shifting, malevolent walls, and the terrifying realization began to dawn, perhaps I hadn't just lost my way out. Perhaps, in its insidious way, the manor had already erased the memory of what out even meant. It wasn't just mildew or decay, it was something sharper, metallic, laced with an undeniable tang of despair. My breath hitched in my throat, each inhale a conscious effort against the oppressive weight of the air. Death row. Here. In my manor. The words echoed, hollow and terrible, in the narrow, stone-lined passage. I ran a hand over the rough-hewn wall, the grit of ancient mortar flaking onto my fingertips. My mind, already a tattered tapestry, struggled to process the implications. Who were these poor souls? And what did marked for closure truly signify? It felt like an act of desperate containment. Driven by a terrible, gnawing curiosity, the same impulse that made me strip away centuries of grime from a forgotten masterpiece, I began to examine the corridor with a frantic intensity. This wasn't just a forgotten wing, it was a wound. My gaze snagged on a section of wall near what must have been a solitary cell. The stones here seemed subtly different, less worn, almost as if they had been meticulously reset. I pressed against the stones, feeling for any give. Nothing. I ran my fingers along the mortar lines, searching for a seam, a weakness. I dug my fingernails into it, scraping away at the brittle mortar. With a soft, grating sigh, a single stone shifted inward. My fingers brushed against something brittle and dry. I pulled out a small, leather-bound journal, its cover warped and cracked, its pages almost fused together by damp and time. The script was faded, spidery, written by a hand that had known fear. The victims weren't ill, they were simply less. For the stories that make a man, the experiences that forge an identity. This was it. The entity. The thing that had been preying on me. It wasn't a ghost, it was a parasite. An ancient, insidious thing that fed on the very essence of consciousness. Its origins, as far as the overseer could discern, were not of this world, yet not alien in the cosmic sense. It was something primal, a malignant echo born from profound suffering, drawn to places where despair festered. The condemned, already stripped of hope and identity, were the perfect, unwitting sustenance. Their minds, already broken, provided a continuous, potent feast. The suffering, he wrote, is a lure. The fear, a spice. It consumes the memory, the spirit, leaving only a vacant vessel, a breathing monument to what was. The ultimate cost, then, was erasure. Not death, but something far worse, the complete obliteration of self. I saw my own fragmented memories, the gaps in my past, reflected in his terrified words. I was becoming one of them. Then I reached the final, horrifying revelation. The overseer, in a desperate, barely legible scrawl, spoke of a ritual. Not to destroy the entity, for it seemed indestructible, but to appease it. To bind it. It demands a sacrifice, he wrote, the word underlined multiple times, a willing surrender. A complete, unyielding offering of self. Not just memory, not just identity, but the conscious choice to become its permanent vessel. To contain its hunger within one mind, for eternity. Only then will the others be spared. Only then will the manor be quiet. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. A willing sacrifice. A mind, strong and vibrant, offered up to become a perpetual prison, a living battery for this ancient horror. It was a chamber for the ultimate, terrifying surrender. My own mind screamed in protest, a cacophony of fear and desperate denial. My identity, already so fragile, felt like a sandcastle against an incoming tide. And now, the truth. The only way to stop it, to save anyone else, was to give it everything. To become nothing. It wasn't a choice between life and death. It was a choice between existence and oblivion. And the oblivion, I knew, was calling my name. The words still echoed in the hollow spaces where my memories used to be, a chilling mantra, a willing sacrifice. A mind, strong and vibrant, offered up to become a perpetual prison, a living battery for this ancient horror. I stumbled through the decaying halls, my hand scraping against the flaking wallpaper, the texture like dried skin. Each step was a struggle, not against the physical decay of the manor, but against the insidious erosion within me. My own thoughts felt like someone else's, borrowed and ill-fitting, and sometimes, for a terrifying moment, they weren't there at all. Just a vast, cold emptiness. I remembered the detective, his face a blur now, his warnings about the manor's history. I remembered the surveyor, a nervous man, his voice cracking as he spoke of bad vibrations. Their words were wisps, but the core of the danger, the truth of it, remained stubbornly intact in my fractured mind. It wanted me. It wanted what little was left of me. I found myself in the great hall, dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering through grimy windows. The grand staircase, once a symbol of opulence, now seemed to coil like a skeletal serpent. My eyes, however, were drawn to a specific section of the wall, where I had begun to strip away layers of paint and plaster months ago. A circuit, etched into the very stone. I'd seen it before, dismissed it as some obscure Masonic symbol, or perhaps a forgotten family crest. My head pounded, a dull, rhythmic ache that mirrored the slow, relentless creep of the entity through my fading self. I knelt, tracing the lines with a trembling finger. This wasn't just ornamentation, it was a design, intricate and precise, hinting at a purpose beyond aesthetics. My restorer's instinct, the one thing the entity hadn't completely devoured, screamed at me. This pattern was a key. It was a map. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through the fog. A fragment of a conversation with the manor's solicitor, long before this nightmare truly began. He'd mentioned some obscure historical document, a deed or an inventory, that spoke of the binding of the house's heart. At the time, I'd scoffed, attributing it to archaic legal jargon. Now, the words resonated with an awful clarity. The house's heart wasn't a physical place. It was a vessel. A mind. The pieces began to click, agonizingly, into place. It wasn't just a place of containment for the victims, a holding pen before their identities were consumed. It was the focus. The conduit. The mechanism designed to channel the entity into a host, and then, crucially, to bind that host. The previous owners hadn't just offered sacrifices, they had attempted to trap the entity within a living mind, using the corridor as the anchor. They had failed, repeatedly, their minds breaking under the strain, becoming batteries instead of prisons. But the intention was there. The design was there. A desperate, terrifying idea began to form in the shattered remnants of my intellect. If the entity needed a strong, vibrant mind to truly exist in this realm, and if the corridor was designed to bind that mind, then perhaps I could turn the tables. I could offer myself, not as a victim, but as the final lock. The plan was a grotesque parody of my life's work. I would restore the manor, yes, but not to its former glory. I would restore its prison. I would use the corridor's forgotten mechanisms, the very symbols I was now deciphering, to bind the entity. But the vessel, the containment unit, would be me. My mind. I would become the living cage, the perpetual prison it sought, but on my own terms. I would offer up my memories, my identity, not to be consumed into oblivion, but to become the walls of its eternal confinement. It meant losing Reed. It meant my consciousness would become a battleground, a constant, silent struggle against an ancient horror, until there was nothing left but a shell, a sentinel. A living, breathing monument to a terrible, necessary sacrifice. To cease to be me. To willingly give up the carefully constructed edifice of my identity, the memories of a life lived, the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly restored antique. It was a death far more profound than any physical cessation, but the alternative? To let it consume me slowly, piece by agonizing piece, leaving me a drooling, vacant husk, while it continued to feed, to spread its influence beyond these walls? That was unthinkable. That was the true horror. The entity was aware. It felt my thoughts, tasted my resolve. It would know my intent. It would fight. My hands clenched into fists, knuckles white. My body felt weak, my mind a sieve, but a core of steel remained. This was my last act of restoration. The most important, the most terrifying. Flaking plaster, my knuckles aching. My mind was a sieve, memories leaking out like sand through torn pockets, but one thing remained, a stubborn anchor in the swirling chaos, the plan. It had solidified amidst the creeping dread, a desperate gamble born from the Manor's own twisted history. I had found it in the ledger, tucked away in the library, not a ritual, but a process. A way to disrupt the entity's feeder lines, to sever its connection to the very structure it had corrupted. My hands, despite their trembling, still remembered the precise movements, the delicate touch required for true restoration. Now, I would use that knowledge to unmake. The entity was aware of my intent. It pressed in, a silent scream that vibrated in my teeth, trying to unravel the last threads of my resolve. Images flickered at the periphery of my vision, my old workshop, vibrant with the smell of linseed oil and polished wood, then dissolving into a skeletal ruin. A colleague's face, smiling, then contorting into a mask of accusing contempt. It wasn't truly a corridor for condemned men, that was a name the Manor's original architect, a man obsessed with containment, had given to a specific, reinforced section of the underground structure. A place designed to hold, to isolate, to imprison. I had found its true purpose in the earliest blueprints, a central conduit, a nexus where the Manor's spirit was meant to be concentrated, then dispersed throughout the property. The entity had merely co-opted it, twisted its function, turning a conduit into a feeding tube. The descent was a nightmare. Read. Remember your mother's face. Remember your first triumph. I clutched at the idea of my plan, a tangible thing in the abstract horror. It was simple, almost brutally so. Not destroy, but reroute. To send the entity's own feedlines back into itself, to choke it on its own sustenance. Finally, I stumbled into the corridor. It was exactly as the blueprints had shown, yet terrifyingly different. Strange, organic-looking growths pulsed in the corners, like dormant, cancerous organs. Along one wall, a series of heavy iron grills, each leading to a small, cell-like alcove, stood sentinel. This was it. I moved to the central grill, the largest and most ornate. These were the conduits. My plan required a specific tool, one I had fashioned from a piece of ancient, lead-infused timber I'd found in the manor's deepest foundations, carved and etched with symbols I barely understood, which the old ledger had described as memory disruptors. As I knelt, gripping the crude tool, the entity struck with full force. My mind exploded with a cacophony of voices, all screaming my name, condemning me. My hands, suddenly, were not my own. They were old, gnarled, covered in liver spots, trembling with palsy. I looked down, horrified, as my skin withered, my knuckles turning to bone. Your delusion. The entity was trying to replace me, not just consume. It wasn't just taking my memories, it was trying to overwrite them, to implant a new identity, a new self, a new prison for its continuous existence. This wasn't merely a battery, it was a host, a puppet. The horrifying realization slammed into me, the willing sacrifice wasn't just giving up their mind, but their entire being, becoming a vessel for the ancient horror, their identity erased, replaced by the entity's own parasitic consciousness. My hands, still feeling like a stranger's, fumbled with the timber tool. I had to fight through the illusion. Restorer. Repair. Reroute. These were my anchors. I jammed the tool into a specific fissure in the central conduit, a place where the petrified sinew branched. A low groan vibrated through the stone, a sound that seemed to come from the very foundations of the earth. The viscous liquid on the walls began to boil, emitting a sickly sweet steam. The phantom old man in my vision screamed, his face melting like wax. The entity shrieked, a soundless scream that tore at the fabric of my sanity. It was like 1,000 needles piercing my brain, each one injecting a memory that wasn't mine, a fear that belonged to another. It was trying to drown me in its own history, to consume my present with its past. But I held fast. My fingers, now feeling like my own again, twisted the timber, pushing it deeper, disrupting the flow. The growths in the corridor began to retract, shriveling into dry husks. The air, for a fleeting moment, felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Then, the entity roared, a sound that finally broke through the silent assault, echoing physically through the corridor, shaking the very stones. The grills along the wall began to rattle, and from behind them, a low, guttural growl emerged, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. I had severed the main line, but I hadn't destroyed it. I had merely angered it, and now, it was fighting back with a primal fury. The battle for Reed had just begun, and the creature was far from defeated. The silence was the first thing that clawed its way back into my awareness. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of the manor's deeper chambers, but something thinner, sharper, like the air after a lightning strike. My eyes fluttered open, gritty and slow, struggling to focus on the impossible gloom. I was lying on something cold, hard, and uneven. My back ached with a dull, persistent throb. A metallic tang coated my tongue, a taste of rust and something else. Something acrid and burnt, like ozone. I pushed myself up, my limbs protesting with a weakness that felt alien. My head swam, each beat of my pulse a dull drum against my temples. The space around me slowly coalesced into a horrifying clarity. Faded numbers were stenciled above the frames, barely legible through decades of accumulated filth. My breath hitched. This wasn't part of the manor I knew. Not the parts I'd painstakingly restored, nor the ones still awaiting my touch. This was new. Or impossibly old, buried deep beneath layers of forgotten architecture, a secret I hadn't unearthed until now. The entity. The confrontation. A jumble of fragmented images flickered through my mind, crushing weight, the deafening roar of stolen memories, a desperate, impossible struggle against an invisible current that sought to drown me in its own twisted reflection. A host. A puppet, and then nothing. My mind was a sieve, leaking details, retaining only a vague sense of victory, a desperate clawing back from the brink. The oppressive presence that had haunted me, whispered to me, twisted my perceptions, was gone. The silence was its absence, an echo of a battle fought and won, but at what cost? I pushed myself to my feet, leaning heavily against the rough concrete wall. My gaze drifted to the nearest cell door. Number 7. The bars were thick with rust, the lock mechanism a solid block of corrosion. Inside, through the grimy window, I could just make out a bare cot, a chipped basin. A prison. Had I trapped it here? Or had it trapped me in some forgotten corner of my own mind, a construct of its lingering influence? Read. Yes, read. The Antique Restorer. I specialized in forgotten histories, in bringing beauty back from decay. The Manor. I inherited it. My great-uncle's property. Or was it my great-aunt's? The details felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. I took a shaky step forward, then another, my boots scuffing softly on the grimy floor. Each step was an effort, not just physically, but mentally. Who was I, truly? The man who had entered the manor, full of meticulous plans and a passion for restoration? Or someone altered, subtly reshaped by the entity's desperate attempt to overwrite me? I reached the next cell, number 6. Faded, barely visible, etched into the concrete. Not words, but symbols. Jagged lines, interlocking spirals, shapes that seemed to shift and writhe at the edge of my vision. They were familiar in a terrifying way, like a half-remembered nightmare. They were the entity's signature, its silent language. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just gone. It was contained. Trapped within these walls, perhaps. But the symbols, the lingering feeling of emptiness within me, suggested a more insidious truth. The entity had been defeated, or at least pushed back, but not before leaving an indelible mark. A scar. I closed my eyes, trying to picture my own face, my own life before the manor. My workshop, the smell of linseed oil and aged wood. My old apartment, the familiar clutter. My family. My family? A blankness. It wasn't just a few memories gone. It was entire swaths of my past, ripped out, leaving gaping wounds in the fabric of who I was. And in their place. What? Nothing? Or something else, waiting to unfurl? I opened my eyes, the flickering bulb at the end of the corridor seeming to mock me. Was this my new prison? A prison not of steel and concrete, but of shattered identity? The entity was defeated, yes. But it had won something far more valuable. It had taken pieces of me, and in doing so, had left me profoundly, irrevocably altered. I was Reed, perhaps. But how much of the original remained? And how much was merely a ghost in a new, unfamiliar shell? The silence stretched, vast and terrifying, promising no answers, only the chilling echo of what was lost. For a long moment, there was only the cold, unyielding press of something beneath me, and the faint, metallic tang of dust and disuse in my mouth. Then, a voice. "Reed? Can you hear me?" I blinked, the world slowly solidifying into blurred shapes. He was a retrieval agent, I think, or perhaps a local officer. Details were hazy, like a dream that dissolves upon waking. I was outside the manor, or so I was told. The manor, they said, was empty. Just a derelict building, nothing more. Weeks bled into months. I tried to rebuild. My old workshop, nestled in a quiet part of the city, felt alien. I took on a small commission, a mahogany writing desk, its veneer chipped, its brass fittings tarnished. The work was meant to be therapeutic, a return to the meticulous rhythms that once defined me. But my hands, usually so steady, sometimes trembled. I'd catch myself humming an unfamiliar tune, a mournful, drawn-out melody that felt ancient and wrong. Or I'd find myself staring at a blank wall, lost in thought, only to realize I couldn't recall what I'd been thinking about, just a vast, echoing emptiness where a memory should have been. I was alive. I was free. One afternoon, while carefully stripping away layers of old varnish from the desk, I paused. A faint scent, like mildewed paper and something else, something metallic and sharp, drifted from the wood itself. I leaned closer, sniffing. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it was there. The scent of the manor. I shook my head, convinced it was my imagination, a phantom memory clinging to my senses. Then I saw it. Not on the desk, but on my own hand. It wasn't a scratch or a bruise. It was a pattern, intricate and unsettling, a tiny, almost invisible glyph. I scrubbed at it, panicked, but it remained, a part of me. My victory felt less like an escape and more like a transfer. The entity hadn't been vanquished, it had merely relocated, finding a new, more intimate host. Me. My memories, the ones I thought I'd lost to the manor's hunger, weren't truly gone. They were simply reordered, filtered. And sometimes, they weren't mine at all. I would remember conversations I'd never had, faces I'd never seen, feelings that were utterly alien to my own experience. One morning, I awoke to find myself not in my bed, but standing in the middle of my workshop, the air frigid. The mahogany desk was overturned, its delicate legs splintered. My tools lay scattered, some bent, some snapped clean in half. I had no memory of doing it. No anger, no frustration. Just a quiet, unsettling calm. It was then I understood. The entity wasn't just influencing me, it was me. Or, rather, I was a new, twisted iteration of it. I started seeking them out. Not consciously, at first. It was an instinct, a pull. One such place was the old district courthouse. It had been condemned for decades, a hulking edifice of crumbling brick and shattered glass. I found a way in, through a gaping hole in a rusted fence, past warning signs that fluttered like tattered flags. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay, of damp plaster and forgotten papers. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows. The walls were scarred, the paint peeling in vast, flaking sheets. A shiver, not of fear but of recognition, traced its way down my spine. This was it. This was where the final echoes lingered, where the last flickers of identity had been snuffed out. The perfect feeding ground. I stepped into the corridor. The floor beneath my feet was uneven, littered with debris. But they weren't empty to me. And I felt a strange, profound satisfaction. A hunger, yes, but also a sense of belonging. The memories weren't just for me to consume, they were part of me. I was the keeper, the absorber, the echo chamber. My victory wasn't over the entity, it was becoming the entity's ultimate expression. A living repository of forgotten identities, constantly seeking, constantly absorbing. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth bloomed beneath my fingers. I could feel the residual fear, the despair, the last gasp of a nameless prisoner. And I didn't flinch. I didn't recoil. Instead, a quiet, almost serene understanding filled me. My eyes, I knew, were no longer entirely my own. Reed was still there, somewhere, a whisper in the vastness. And the hunger. The hunger was endless. It was my hunger now. And I had an eternity to feed it.